Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. Long before he wrote 1984, Eric Blair was a 19-year-old policeman in Burma. Biographies skirt over that 5-year period, in part due to the absence of letters and diaries, but it was the making of the writer who would become George Orwell. Today's guest set out to imagine those years in a wonderful new novel called Burma Sahib. Paul Theroux is the author of some 33 works of fiction, including The Mosquito Coast and The Bad Angel Brothers, and 19 travel books, including The Great Railway Bazaar and Dark Star Safari, books that cemented his standing as our greatest living travel writer. I've read all of them over the last 30 years. They were such an important influence on me as a young traveler and writer, and I got enormous enjoyment from them as a reader. We spoke about George Orwell and Burma, of course, but this was also a conversation about reading and the life of a writer. I enjoyed it so much that we continued long after the recording stopped, something like 3 hours. My wife actually came in to check on me, wondering why I was still in my room past midnight. I really enjoyed this, and I know you'll enjoy it too. Before we jump in, I want to take a second to tell you about my new book. It's called A Sunny Place for Shady People, and it's about 6 years I spent on the island of Malta. I wanted to write a breezy island book inspired by Lawrence Theroux, and so I moved to a country I'd never visited in the middle of the Mediterranean. Things were good at first. They were comical, and there was history and culture and new friends to enjoy. And then there was an election, and everything changed. I watched as an organized criminal network took over the government of a European Union member state with the widespread support of its citizens. At first, it seemed like the place was on the rise. People had more money. Life was improving in some ways, but there was a growing sense that bounds were slipping, as that those tentacles of corruption crept outwards from the office of the Prime Minister and poisoned the entire country. It culminated in the brutal car bomb assassination of a writer I admired, the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. The office of the Prime Minister was implicated in her murder, but no politicians have been arrested or charged. I'm convinced that the roots of it all are deeply embedded in the culture, and that's what I set out to show in the book. A Sunny Place for Shady People is available now from Trinity University Press and from booksellers everywhere. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Paul Theroux. So you open Burma Sahib with a young Eric Blair aboard ship on his way to Rangoon. He immediately becomes an object of surveillance by a meddling couple who stalk him for the entire journey. And Orwell wrote about this in Burmese Days. He referred to it as the Indian marriage market. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, there weren't a lot of women, marriageable women. Marriageable would be English or Scottish or Irish, because local women were off limits. If a British civil servant or policeman or any British member of the Raj married a local woman, his career was over. And it wasn't only over there. The same was true. I wrote a piece about Hong Kong, and when it was handed over in 96, 97, I was there. And a man told me that if you married a local Chinese woman, you didn't advance in the civil service. So it was racist. The marriage market, though, is so if a woman came, in Burmese Days, the woman is called Elizabeth Lacastine. Lacastine is a member of the club. She comes, and Flory, the main character, falls in love with her. But she's seduced by a man called Viral. The thing about Viral is that the name Viral comes from Orwell's past. There was a guy called Viral who was a bully at Orwell's school. So this odious guy in Burmese Days becomes Viral. So the marriage market, in terms of the ship, they see him, the woman sees his tie on the ship. His tie's flapping, and she's got her guy says, "Alec, do you see his tie?" He says, "What about, what's the big deal?" "Eaten," she says. And they think, okay, well, so you say stalk. They do stalk him, but they've kind of tipped a wink to him. They invite him for tea, but through that, I mean, the woman has a chaperone because it's all has to be up and up. And Blair has an affair with the chaperone. So that's so much for the marriage market. In terms of, I mean, it wasn't really necessary. In Africa, they used to say, are you married or are you to live in Nairobi? Because it was so free and easy. And in Burma, local women were so freely available. It was never, to find romance, or at least for a night, all you had to do was go to one of the many brothels where the women were very pretty and skilled in the arts of love. And so Blair, George Orwell, took advantage of that. I mean, he was a very randy guy, actually. Even later, when he turned from Blair to Orwell, he romanced a lot of women. He had an affair with a woman. The whole time he was married, he had an affair with a woman called Brenda, I believe. And then when his wife died, Eileen died, he was looking for the next Mrs. Orwell. And he said, I don't have long to live, but I think, I think I could make you happy and it might be fun. It wasn't about love. He just needed women companionship. It's a side of Orwell that you don't get much in the biographies. So in Burma, he took advantage of that. And that was for a 19-year-old Etonian who went to school with all boys, who only had one just platonic romance with a woman called Jacinta. He knew nothing about women, but he learned it there. And one of his early poems is about a prostitute who, very sweet-faced woman. And he says, I'll give you 20 rupees. And she's very sweet. She bats her eyes. She said, 25. Okay, 25. So it's that kind of Kipling-esque poem.
So you mentioned poetry quite often in the book, actually, and you show him writing poetry. So does his real poetry survive? Did you find examples of it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a famous poem that starts, a happy vicar I might have been 100 years ago to preach upon eternal doom and watch my flowers grow. And then it ends, I wasn't born for an age like this. I dwelt upon marble halls. I woke to find it true. I wasn't born for an age like this. Was Smith, was Jones, were you? Then his Kipling-esque poem. So he started like a lot of us. I mean, I wrote poem when I was in Africa.
Yes, you admitted to that. I heard on a recent podcast. Are we going to see a volume of your youthful poetry anytime soon?
No, you will not see them. But actually, I remember. I can tell you the first publication, 1964, I wrote a poem that appeared in the Central African Examiner, and it was published in Salisbury, now Harare, Southern Rhodesia, and that was a big thrill. I remember I got the magazine. There was my poem on the page. I was 22 years old, and I thought, holy moly, this is great. I'm a poet. So he wrote them. It's a youthful thing. You won't see mine. You won't see but Orwell. If you checked, you would see there's probably a half a dozen Orwell poems, including that I wasn't born for an age like this, and the one about the prostitute, and there's a number of them. And then he wrote them, but some of them the earliest thing he wrote was a poem. It was about Merry England or something like that. And then he wrote a poem about the First World War when he would have been about 13, 14 years old. But that's a youthful enthusiasm. The thing is, he didn't write fiction when he was in Burma, but he read a lot. So that's a useful thing.
Yeah.
So when he was at Burma, he was reading D.H. Lawrence and H.G. Wells, Jack London, and that was a very formative period in his life.
I wanted to ask you about that, actually, because I really like that part of the book that you referenced his reading and the inner life of a reader. So where did you find it? You tracked down that he was actually reading these books at the time. I mean, Martin Eden is a very apt choice for an aspiring writer.
Oh, yeah. He was highly influenced by Jack London. Martin Eden, he read People of the Abyss. What did he get out of People of the Abyss? I mean, Jack London went to London, changed his clothes. He pawned his clothes. He got an old clothes and went to the East End and wrote about the poverty in the East End. What happened to Orwell in 1927, 28? He did exactly the same thing. He never mentions Jack London in Down and Out in Paris and London, but that was influence. I mean, his books are derived from all his reading. You could say that about writers in general. I mean, I love talking to readers. Readers have an inner life. I could talk to anyone who reads. Doesn't matter. Any country, any place. If they read books, I mean, I live in a place where no one reads. I'm in Hawaii, and I never meet people who read my books here. I don't know anyone who reads them. Well, I take that back. I mean, I know there's a guy in Honolulu. I don't live in. It's 40 miles away. Yeah, he reads my stuff. Good. Okay, great. But I have no profile here. No one reads. Even if they did, if they to a non-reader, a writer is a strange creature. A book is a strange thing. A book is a vaguely difficult, mystical thing. You know, that, like, what do you do with it? So Orwell had this. I mean, he survived in Burma because of his reading, and he was deeply influenced. I mean, Orwell did not have a great imagination for writing. His novels very derivative of Jack London, the derivative of H.G. Wells. 1984 was derivative of a book called We by Evgeny Zamyatin. So Zamyatin's book We is looked. I mean, it's just 1984 and We are almost the same book. You know, I mean, with a few differences, but very, very few. He couldn't have written 1984 unless he'd read this Russian novel, which he read. I think it was translated in the 30s. I think he read it in French, actually. Anyway, so he had a passionate interest in reading, and he read everything, and he was very liberated by D.H. Lawrence. He was a huge supporter of Henry Miller. He loved Tropic of Cancer. I mean, he's really turned. And when he went to the Spanish Civil War, he stopped in Paris. He saw Henry Miller, and Inside the Whale is about Henry Miller. Well, you think of Orwell, the clear-sighted, decent St. George, and you think of Henry Miller swearing and whoring, and like Rambo. It's like a different. But that was kind of the secret life of Orwell. Kind of admired this reckless, anarchistic person. Also, I would say that I read Orwell once recommended a Jack London story called The Chinago. May not ring a bell with you.
No.
But Jack London wrote it when Jack London was here in Hawaii, and then he went to Tahiti. When he went to Tahiti, he heard the story. It's a story it's a classic colonial story of French gendarmes arrest a man for murder. He's called Cho. He works in a plantation. He's Chinese. And he doesn't speak French, and they don't understand him, but they're pretty sure that he committed this murder. They're taking him to be hanged. Well, he's not the murderer. And they realize as they're going that it's not him. He's trying to explain, it's not me. Where are we going? We're going to hang him. And they think, well, it's a hot day. It's not Cho. The other guy's called Chu. Well, what do you do? Well, they hang him. Even though they know he's innocent. So Orwell said it's one of the scariest stories. So he probably read that when he was in Burma, because it appeared before that, and he claims that he read. So that's a story about colonialism. And although he's a policeman in Burma, and he's a colonial, and he has to take orders, he's reading this stuff that is shedding the most vicious light, or light on the viciousness of colonialism, and that he gets from his reading. He's not getting it from other people.
Well, this is a common thread throughout the entire book. Burma Sahib is this sense of him living a dual life or a deep secret life. Like at several points on that same outward ship journey I mentioned before, you have him say things like, "How do I avoid knowing them? And they're knowing me." He's evasive. He keeps to his cabin. He shuns the society of others. So was he always a loner like this?
Yes, he was. He had friends. I mean, Cyril Connolly was a very good friend of his at Eton, but he was always kind of a remote figure. I mean, he needed women, but to be a writer, you need to have a secret life. You need to have a double life. You can't go around telling people, I'm a writer, I'm a writer. So what are the most necessary thing for a writer? Is not to be interrupted, right? To have your own time, right? So people talk about how marriage is difficult for a writer. Well, friends are difficult for a writer. Lots of things are difficult. If a writer is a selfish, vaguely unbalanced person. So Orwell had this. He was, I won't say he was a loner, but he certainly had very few close friends that he confided in. The thing about Blair Orwell is that when you think about it, Orwell was born in 1903, right? He died in 1950 when he was 46 years old. His first book was published in 1933 and Down and Out in Paris and London. It's either 32 or 33. So if he died in 1950, I mean, his career was 16 years. So how do you write as much as he writes? How do you live as a writer, support yourself as a writer for 16 years and get all that done and not be a loner? I mean, think of what a short career he had.
Yeah.
I've been writing for 60 years. And I mean, I published this poem that I mentioned earlier. I published in 64. That was a poem I was paid for. It was in a magazine. And then I wrote short stories. Same thing, 64, 65, I was writing. And I published my first book in 67. So that's long ago. I'm not boasting. I'm just saying I lived. You know, I didn't smoke. I didn't have bad lungs. He did. And he kept smoking and he died. But he had a very, very short career. And to die at the age of 46 is amazing. Yeah. Other people, you know, Scott Fitzgerald died in his 40s. Lots of people died. Well, Jack London died in his 40s. Lots of people have. But so it's a short, intense career. Was he a loner? Yeah. And I think that readers tend to be loners. I mean, if you're reading, you don't want to be interrupted. You want to sit down. Hey, I'm reading. You don't want people, hey, what are you reading over there? So you find your own space, your own life. And I would say that a reader has an intense personal inner life, an intense inner life, that the characters in novels are much more real to them than the people who are walking around, you know, like someone they know, Bob Smith, Mary Jones. Yeah, okay, fine, I don't know what they do, but they know Madame Bovary, Emma Bovary. They know everything about Emma Bovary. They don't need to, you know, everything you need to know about a woman is there in Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, you know, or Leopold Bloom. You know everything about them. And so I think that aspect of writing, of reading, informs a writer, but it also it gives you a life. And that was a survival strategy that Blair had in Burma, reader. So he had lots of time for reading.
And his obsession with not being known reminded me of your novel, A Dead Hand, where the narrator meets someone called Paul Theroux. And he says, Theroux didn't want me to know him. He didn't want anyone to know him, which was why he did nothing but pretend to write about himself, never quite coming clean, offering all these versions of himself until he disappeared into a thicket of half-truths that he hoped was art. Is this misdirection or is this true?
Probably half true. I'm interested, if no one ever mentions this book, A, so thanks, Ryan. And B, I've never really, I could say the only book that I've come across where the author appears in the book is Maigrey's Memoirs by George Simenon. So Simenon appears in Maigrey's Memoirs, and Maigrey kind of talks to him. It's a great book. I love Simenon, by the way.
I think I have it in the other room. I haven't read him yet, but I did come across him from something you wrote.
What book do you have in the other room?
It's a big omnibus. I found in a London bookshop. So I think it has the memoirs. I think it's about 10 or 12 books.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, have a go at it. Have a go. I mean, there's some great, Black Snow is a great book. The Cat is a great book. I mean, there are lots of it. He had also, he wrote hundreds of novels. So I don't know where to begin, but I've read 3 biographies of Simenon, and I really, you know, I'm not the only person. I mean, Henry Miller went out of his way to meet him,
Hmm.
praised him. William Faulkner praised him. Name a writer. I mean, he's the right, in a way, a writer's writer. Although he also has a tremendous popularity. I'm trying to think whether Orwell never mentioned him. Anyway, but what I was saying is that the you were talking about the Paul Theroux that appears in my novel, The Dead Hand. I just thought that was, kind of interesting.
Hmm.
Put me in a book, and it kind of it's metafiction. It's a way of distancing myself from the book. And
Was that also a reference to My Secret History or My Other Life, kind of? Because those are, you could see those as fictional autobiographies in a sense.
yeah, they are. Yeah, yeah. I'll never write an autobiography. I mean, I could. I've used every aspect of my life I've put in a book, so that will never happen.
Hmm.
Orwell did not want a biography, by the way, and would have been interested to see how many there are 7 or 8 pretty good biographies of him.
So to come back to his, you mentioned that he went to Eton, and
Yep.
but he didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge like his
No.
peers. He went into the colonial service. Why?
Pressure from his family, money. Yeah, he didn't. He came from a very hard up colonial family. I mean, his father was opium agent class 4. He never made any money. They always lived in very small, pokey houses in the Thames Valley, and then in Southwold. They never had any money. So Oxford wasn't much of an option. Also, I think he wanted to get away from his old Etonian friends. I mean, people like Runciman, Cyril Connolly, a guy called Christopher Hollis. He wanted to distance himself from them. And it was a very good thing that he did, because if you read any biography of, say, someone who was at Oxford at the time, someone like Evelyn Waugh or Anthony Powell, Oxford was a drunken orgy. They just drank. There was a lot of gay sort of friendships, people sleeping late, missing classes, quitting, all the things that would have driven Orwell up the wall. I mean, Blair, as he was then, he would have hated it. It was a great decision to go to Burma, although he thought it was a mistake. A month or so after he arrived, he thought, I've made a mistake. But it would have been a bigger mistake to go to Oxford. And I mean, there's a lot of books about, take Evelyn Waugh at Oxford, or Evelyn Waugh didn't finish, but he writes about Oxford in Brideshead Revisited too.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not Orwell territory at all. I mean, Orwell would have been Orwell was a very studious, very good student at Eton. He passed Greek and Latin exams to join the British Civil Service, the colonial service. He passed with high marks. I mean, he was a great linguist and an excellent student, a brilliant man. And he would have been very depressed. Henry Green, Henry Green was at Oxford at the same time. So Henry Green, Connolly, Waugh, Oxford was a playground. Well, Orwell would have hated that, Blair, that as he was. So it was a good decision. So he went, but he went for money, didn't get a scholarship, pressure from the family, and also the key thing, he had family in Burma. So his grandmother was there, French grandmother. He had an uncle there. He had several cousins, mixed race cousins. And so he went. The biographers never make much of this. They don't make much of the fact that, Orwell was, in a way, when he was going to Burma, he was going home. His mother was born there. So, and that influenced him. Also, Kipling, I mean, he's written a lot about Kipling, how Kipling's a good, bad poet. But Kipling was a big influence on his life. Plain Tales from the Hills is really to his taste, because it's about outsiders. Kipling was an outsider in India. Plain Tales from the Hills is a lot of short stories about outsiders. The poem Mandalay was one of Orwell's favorite poems. So for a lot of reasons, he didn't go to Eton, and it was an inspired thing. And although he hated, I mean, people hate their first job. But there's a job that defines you. You do it and you find out, I have this job, I hate it, I'm doing it, and it inspires you to do the thing that you really want to do.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the process of discovering what you really want. Well, you often find it by doing a job you hate. When you think of George Orwell as a policeman, that's like the anti-Orwell.
Well, it also this idea of going away. In Sunrise with Sea Monsters, you said great travelers seldom come from small, unstable countries, and children who leave a house and two parents behind don't often return since they seek to attach themselves to something greater or to find a new identity. Do you think it's necessary to go away to carve out that new identity? And was it necessary for Orwell?
You don't have to go far, but you need to detach yourself from your family. I mean, a family is a terrible thing if you want to find out who you are, what you want. It's an imprisoning, fractious thing. Even maybe happy families are the worst. I don't know, that you never really find out who you are if you live in. I mean, I wrote a book called Motherland, which is really about that,
Yeah.
which is a terrible family. But I have an abiding belief that the only way to become a writer is to leave home. If you don't have to go to the Congo or India, all you need to do is go away, cross the border. I mean, Pritchett said a writer is a man on a frontier, that he has to cross that frontier. And so the Jungian way of looking at it is that you need to undergo this process of individuation. And it's not a linear, it's not, you don't go in a straight line to become this person. It's a back and forth thing. What happened to Orwell in Burma was that he was a policeman. And that's kind of interesting. What's more interesting is what happened afterwards. So after he's got a uniform, he's got power, he has a girlfriend, he's got access to money and authority, shoots an elephant and all that stuff, and he's got he's big man, big bug in the police, as his uncle says. After Burma, what happened? He becomes a dishwasher. Huh? Amazing. Amazing. And then he becomes a tramp in London. And then he writes a book. Well, the book about Burma was his second book. His first book was about, he was originally going to call it Confessions of a Dishwasher. And, from being a staunch policeman in the Raj, someone from a Merchant Ivory movie or E.M. Forster or what have you, then he's in a nice restaurant, but he's in a grubby kitchen. I mean, it's a great story, but that choice is, so how do you become a writer? Do you become a writer going to Burma? Not really, though it helps. Become a dishwasher? Yeah, there's a story. Then later he realized Burmese Days was possible. But Burmese Days is a very inaccurate portrait of Blair, Orwell in Burma. I mean, it's very selective. And for that reason, I don't think it's a very good book. I mean, let's say it's a good book, but it's not a great book.
Yeah. Well, there's also, speaking of going away, being an outsider opens your eyes to, going abroad facilitates that, I think. It was certainly true for me. I mean, I grew up in a 4,000 person town, as you know, and I didn't think that was interesting at all. I saw nothing interesting in the place around me. Now I think it's very interesting to go back there, but I had to go away to find a subject and to see the world around me in a fresh way. You know how when going abroad makes you see everything is fresh, everything is vivid. So, I mean, going to a place as alien as Burma must have been just the smells, the sights, the sounds all around him. You must have found this as well in going to Africa.
Yes, totally. I mean, Joseph Conrad once said, I was a mere animal before I went to Africa. I was a mere animal. Went to Africa, up the Congo River. That was the making of him as a writer. Well, being on a ship was the making of him too, I would say. In terms of Orwell, yeah, definitely, that was the case. Imagine you have all the skill that he had at Eton to learn Latin and Greek and French. He was a French speaker. Then he goes to Burma. He learned Hindi. He learned Burmese. Suddenly he could talk to people. He didn't have close friends, but he knew people. He could talk to them. And he kept Hindi in his head the rest of his life. So suddenly he realized he has a skill. So going away is important. Learning the language is really important. I think going to a new country, being alone, dealing with people, realizing how small you are, how your family, your hometown is not a subject. What's a subject? The Congo, Burma, Mandalay, E.M. Forster is a great example of it. He goes to India, writes a great book. So, yeah, I think that is important. I mean, no one listens to me, but I always say that. I mean, when I'm not a teacher, but if anyone asks me, I want to become a writer, what should I do? I'd say, well, do you live at home? Yeah. I said, well, leave home. What do you think I should do? Do you think I should go to the Iowa Writers Workshop? I'd say, no. Why don't you become a teacher in Uzbekistan? Why don't you go to Africa? Become a humble teacher in Malawi, or learn Spanish, go to Mexico. In other words, put yourself in a precarious position where you're small and you need to be a watchful as like an endangered, like an animal that's under siege by other animals. And then it will all your senses will be alert. And then read. You want to become a writer? Read. So I taught in 1972. I taught for a semester at the University of Virginia, the last job I had. And I said, so we're going to read Dubliners. And I remember when there was an objection. Well, hey, we're here to. Hey, dude, we want to write something. I wrote a story, dude. And I said, no, we're going to read Chekhov. We're going to read Joy. I said, you can't write if you don't read. Have you read? No, I haven't read it, but I got this story about this guy. And I got a lot of pushback. And I thought, what am I doing here? They don't want to read. You want to write, and you don't read? Like, what are you doing? So I quit. And I was supposed to be there a year. And I said, I give up. I don't want another job. That was 1972. I've never had a job since then, or teaching. And Orwell is a pretty good example of someone. First, look at Orwell's prose. Orwell's prose, in the beginning, he's writing poetry, and he wrote a very early piece about Burma. He wrote it when he was in the hospital, 1927, 28. It appeared in a French anti-colonial newspaper. It's pretty good. But in his middle period, when Orwell's writing essays, there is no greater essayist than Orwell. No greater. I mean, choose any essay. Clearly, brilliantly written. So he has an essay on writing, politics in the English language. Great. His fiction is good. It's not great, but you can see that he has. You can see that he loves H.G. Wells and he wants to write. So how did he become a writer? He didn't study writing. He didn't go to a writer's workshop or anything like that. He read books and he lived. I mean, he really lived. So, I mean, that's how you become a writer. It's a long apprenticeship becoming a writer. He realized that. But as I said, he had a very short career, and he was very poor. He never made any money. After he hadn't made money in Burma, but he basically was an underpaid writer until he wrote 1984. Then he made money, and he had money for 2 or 3 months and died, and his widow became rich.
There's also a sense, too, in going abroad of being able to invent yourself, because you're living in a place where no one knows you, so you're not held back by the place that you came from. You're not stuck in those boxes of the world that you grew up in, and you can in a sense be anything or figure out what to be. Like you said something about this in The Family Arsenal, which is a 1976 novel. To live abroad was to create a mythology about yourself, more than a new personality, a liberating fantasy that you could believe in, a new world. So was there a sense that Orwell was also kind of inventing himself afresh there? This post-Eton period?
You just quoted something that I forgot I wrote. So that's quite good. You can't pay a writer a greater compliment than quoting his or her books. It's something I totally believe. I totally believe that you go and it's not simply that you're inventing a person. You are becoming the person that you're meant to be. That's who you are. There's there's no narrative around you of what are you going to do? You're going to be a writer. Who's going to publish your stuff? What are you going to write about? What are you going to be? What are you going to do with your life? No one asks you questions like that when you're traveling. When you're traveling or you're living in a different place, they take you as a person, and you take them as a person. You have no history. And
Yeah.
so also ideally you're speaking to them in their language, and you're learning to speak to them. So this is why I'm not a great fan of, say, William Faulkner. William Faulkner never went anywhere. He never went anywhere. He wrote about Mississippi. Okay, great books. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are classics. But he's still writing about Mississippi and writing about Mississippi. And, people who write about their hometown, I'm not interested. I'm really not interested. I'm interested in people who go from one place to another and write about that place. I'll give you an example. Carlo Levi. Carlo Levi was from Florence. He was banished to southern Italy by Mussolini because he objected to the Mussolini's behavior in Abyssinia, Ethiopia. So Carlo Levi, who's a doctor, goes to this small town called Aliano in southern Italy. Never been there before. And he writes the greatest book of a sense of place, Christ Stopped at Eboli. One of the great books. Why? Because he left, because he's not from there. He went. And he saw that the people are different. They're not Italian. He said these are Italians like Italians he's never met in his life. And they think he's strange because, A, he speaks Italian with a Florentine accent, but most of all, he's Jewish. And they've never seen a Jew before. And I went there in 1995, and I went to Aliano, and I said, "What about Carlo Levi?" And they say, "Ebreo." He was a Jew. They said, "Yeah, he wasn't really an Italian. He was a Jew." Ebreo, è un uomo ebreo, davvero? Sì, Levi, un ebreo. He's a Jew. He's a Hebrew. I thought, this is amazing. Still, many years later, this thing. But anyway, in terms of, it's the same country. So, I would have been much more interested in Faulkner. Faulkner writes a little bit about Harvard, but he never wrote about Hollywood. Faulkner could have written brilliantly about Hollywood. He was a drunken scriptwriter, a very successful one, by the way, but he never wrote about it. He never wrote about California. He could have written brilliantly. He was different, but he didn't. Anyway, so that's another story. But I'm just talking about preference. So my preference is the loner. If any book I've written, I would say it's an individual who's isolated, who is got to solve a problem. I don't write about groups of people. I'm not writing about a club or a cult or a guy in his hometown. I write about people who are separated, either in Africa or they're Mexico or they're India or they're wherever they are. That tends to be my subject. I'm not saying it should be everybody's subject, but the subject, it was how I learned to be a writer. And in a way, that was Orwell's thing, because in Orwell's first novel, he's writing about a man who's completely, in Burmese days, who's isolated. He's not like the others. He doesn't like the other people in the club. He's not on the same page with them. He happens to be a middle-aged timber merchant. He's not a policeman. Or it would have been great if he was a policeman. If Orwell had written about his life as a policeman, it would have been fantastic. So it was left to me. So I had to write. But I was thinking, this is a much better subject than anything that Orwell wrote about. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how you use traces of Burmese days in your book. Like, you show him taking an interest in Burma early on in the novel, unlike his peers. So he hikes up the hill overlooking Mandalay. He wanders the town with a disgraced former policeman who was accused of going native. And he shows this girl around who you mentioned earlier, who has no interest in the culture, but he clearly does. But I like how you flipped it. So in Burmese days, he's writing about a timber merchant who from the perspective of that character. But in your book, it happens to someone else, a friend of Eric Blair, becomes obsessed with this girl. So it's almost like you see your book shows the writer gathering the material for the book that would become Burmese Days. So for someone who's read Burmese Days, it's interesting. It's like you backdated that and projected it forward in a sense.
Yes, and the reason I did that is I have a feeling that all of Orwell's fiction derives from actual experiences of his life. So, A Clergyman's Daughter is about a girl who's a hop picker. She picks hops and she kind of leaves home. Well, he was a hop picker. Keep the Aspidistra Flying is about a kind of scruffy but funny guy who writes poems who works in a bookshop. Orwell worked in a bookshop. He worked in the bookshop was there. I mean, there's a little plaque on it. And he got all that from the bookshop. Coming Up for Air, he wrote in Morocco, but it was inspired by his sense of living in the Thames Valley, which was idyllic when he was living there. And it's a man that goes back to the Thames Valley and sees what became of his hometown. Well, I'm sure Orwell went back to the village that he was living in the Thames Valley, like the character in Coming Up for Air, George Bowling. 1984 is derived from reading from Zamyat. So I was thinking, well, where did Orwell get the idea for Burmese Days, for this love affair? He must have seen a guy fall in love with a woman and been jilted by her. I mean, that must have happened. He kind of invented it because he didn't have a girlfriend. He had an affair with a woman in my book, and I think he really did have an affair with a married woman. It's the biographers. Biographer can't really speculate, but a novelist can speculate. So all of this, what you say is flipping it, is in a way, I'm thinking, well, if you read Burmese Days, that's a source book for another novel. I mean, how did he write Burmese Days? It's by living it or observing it. The trouble is, he didn't write about all the amazing things that happened to him when he was in the Delta, when he was in Rangoon, when he was in Moulmein. There's just a hanging and shooting an elephant. That's it, really. But I mean, when you think that he had relatives there, I mean, it would have been great if he'd written about his relative, but he didn't. Just because it's kind of disgraceful. He had cousins who were half Indian or half Burmese. Well, that was kind of a no-no. You don't write about them. And so my book is derived from, it's everything in my book is based on something factual or something solid. I didn't make this out of nothing. I made it out of snippets, suggestions, clues, the pulses of the air. And so I built my book out of that. And so I think it's an accurate book. And it was a very satisfying book to write too, because it's in a different idiom. The idiom is the 1920s. Well, some reviews complained about it. Well, people in the 1920s didn't talk the way we talk now. They had different vocabulary, they had a different way of speaking. They used words that we don't use now, including a lot of words that are forbidden now or, bad. They had attitudes that were forbidden. So as you're writing about a different period, you got to channel that energy, that linguistic energy, the cultural energy. You're channeling that and writing about it. And it has to be authentic. And so it's a challenge to write. I found it stimulating and exhausting at the same time to write. And also I was wondering, in the 1920s, did they use a word, like, I was chuffed. I was chuffed to meet him. Did people say, English people use it all day. I was really chuffed, pleased. Did they use that word? Well, I found out, they did use the word. But you got to be careful because a lot of slang is recent or is after Second World War, not 1920s. So I had to do a lot of reading. And then it helped that in terms of the idiom, it helped. I lived for 18 years in London. And so I started living in 1971, 72. Well, people from the 1920s were still alive, and they still used those expressions. So I knew people of an age, I knew people who were born at the turn of the century. I knew people who knew Orwell. V.S. Pritchett knew Orwell.
Wow.
Pritchett, I used to ask him about, he was kind of annoyed because he didn't like Orwell. He thought Orwell was wrong about Spain and whatnot. But he knew Orwell. Anthony Powell went to school with him. I knew him. And so it was, that was very helpful. It's a connection between, I knew Pritchett. Pritchett was born in 1900. I knew him very well, actually. And he knew Orwell, and saw him all the time. He said once that, I said, what would Orwell say to you when you greeted you? He said, he'd mildly insult you and then walk away. That was one of the things Pritchett said. He'd mildly insult. He'd go up to you and say something. The way a bloke might, hi, Ryan, how are you? You're the Canadian, right? Yeah, and then move on. What do you hear from Canada? It would be that kind of remark that Pritchett said Orwell would make. I've never heard a biographer mention that aspect of Orwell's character.
You could see too that your experience of living in England come out in your understanding of the class system in this novel. Like there's a scene on the ship on the outward journey where you describe this sort of floating community of the Raj going back to India, and you said many had the peculiar plummy accents of English people who had lived abroad for years, who had refined and improved their lower middle class accents, making the women sound actressy and the men bluff, honking and huffing. It's the sense of how an accent places someone and how nobody knows them over there, so they can subtly elevate themselves.
I got that from living in Malawi, Nyasaland, and then again from living in Singapore, where there are a lot of obviously lower middle class people who, because they went to a colony or went abroad, would kind of improve their accent. And they would kind of, if they're meeting an American, they think, well, an American's not going to know that my father was fixing bicycles in Leicester. And so they would affect a plummy accent. I didn't understand it till I went to England. I lived in England, and I realized, oh, I get it. These are people. There's an expression, jumped up. People use, he's jumped up. It's an English expression meaning he's moved up a class. So he's pretending to be a class that he's not. Well, you can't get away with that in England. In England, an English person would say, you're affecting that accent. I know what you're doing, and you're not kidding me. And so you can't get away with it. But you can get away with it if you live in Singapore and you're talking to Singaporeans, Chinese, Indians. I say, my man, jolly good, and they think, oh yeah, he's very British, except it's a guy from the East End of London, or I don't know, from Liverpool or whatever. Jolly good, I say, man, my man. And so I came across that a lot. I didn't actually understand it initially. It took a while to sink in, but I was in Africa for 6 years, and I met these people all the time. And they weren't teachers. They tended to be mechanics, civil servants, something else in the trades somehow. And they affected this accent. So Orwell, who was very class conscious himself, he said he came from the upper lower middle class, the upper lower middle. So that's that category, upper lower middle. He was very tuned to it, and his books, like H.G. Wells's books, his books are full of very interesting accents. I mean, Keep the Aspidistra Flying has it. There's a lot of class. There's an upper class socialist in Keep the Aspidistra Flying, and the way people talk, people in the bookshop. Got some lovely books for you. Gorgeous geography. Got some geography books for you. He says geography books. I got a notion, George. So he gets that from Wells and also from life, and so I was able to use that, and it helps. I never really used it much before, but I realized I knew people from the 1920s and I knew people from the colonies, so I was able to, channel that. It was very helpful. And then Scottish people. I got a lot of pushback from the publisher, by the way. I mean, the publisher thought, you're hard on the Scots. Well, so was Orwell. You're objectifying women. You say this fox-faced women. Well, Orwell saw women people in animal terms. In one of his diaries, he said, I saw a Japanese man on the street. He had the face of a suffering monkey. The face of a suffering monkey. Well, that's great. Not PC. I mean, I was thinking of using the book, but maybe, I don't know, didn't. And then the public editors, copy editors, you can't say this word. You got the N word. Well, we're talking about the 1920s, mate. I mean, Burmese days, the N word is used a lot. And Kipling uses it. Well, I used it twice in the book. And I had to really fight my corner by saying, this is how someone would have been objected to in a club. He wants to join. That's how natives were seen. They didn't call them natives, they used that word. So I used it a couple of, anyway, that's the idiom too. That's the idiom of the 20s, the idiom of the 50s for that matter in the United States. So, the idiom today for a lot of people. So anyway, that's part of writing a historical novel. Our novel, it's set in its period, but I had to be true to Orwell and true to the time.
Interesting too that in one of his early postings in the Delta, you show him gathering evidence against the seditious monk. You've already shown him to be interested in the Burmese and sympathetic towards them, but the things that the monk says to him kind of plant the seed of doubt in his head. These doubts are growing and growing, and we also see it in his promotion when his period of probation is lifted. He doesn't regard this as a success, but further proof that the whole thing's a sham because they didn't see through him. Because he felt himself to be entirely unsuited. So are these the experiences that plant the seed for the Orwell, the man he would become, basically?
Yeah. And it's interesting you should mention the monk, because everything the monk says, Orwell said in this early essay. So when he left Burma, he wrote this piece for a French newspaper. And he makes all these points about colonialism in Burma. And I used all these points, that is quotations, I gave to the monk and to other people. So everything that he wrote later, I have him hear from various people, Burmese, Indians, the woman, Mrs. Jellicoe, whatever. They say those things to him. And he writes them later. So they're authentic. I mean, those were Orwell's thoughts. So I didn't invent them. I invented the name of the monk, or rather, I used the name of the monk. That monk, Ashwin Wiratu, is a monk who lives. If you go to Burma, or if you Google his name, you'll see he's a monk. He's a very angry, electrifying speaker, and very popular among people. But in Burma today, Ashwin Wiratu. I thought, well, I'm going to use him. He's a monk. That's a monk's name. He's angry. So I gave him that name. And then, there are a lot of, that's a private reference, but it's an authentic one.
And you said earlier, his position as a young policeman gave him immense authority and immense power at a very young age, which can't fail to go to someone's head. And he was also educated at Eton, like so many other scions of empire, the people that would go on to rule the British Empire. Why wasn't he corrupted by that power like so many others? I mean, he went in the completely opposite direction.
He was very clear-sighted. He was aware of the class system before he went, because he was a scholar at Eton, and he was well aware that the other kids had money, big families. He talks about it in what such were the joys. He talks about the class systems, how the students say, we're going shooting in Scotland. And my father, he talks about how they boast. Well, there are a lot of boasters in Burma. He was conditioned not to be corrupted by it. You could say he was incorruptible. I mean, that because of his experience at Eton, and because of his character, I suppose, his reading, that he wasn't someone who would be corrupted by the system, although he would have said that he was corrupted, because he talks about how he used to hit his servants. He used to kick them. He supervised a hanging. He was involved with the empire, and to that extent, he was a cog in the machine, right? So you could say he's doing wicked things, but the effect of that, the net effect, was atonement. So everything that he did after Burma was in terms of atonement. I mentioned earlier, a man doesn't easily, or a woman for that matter, go from a position of power to becoming a dishwasher. So that was, you say, not only was he not corrupted, he wanted to prove his bona fide change in character. I mean, or his intentions, in it. He would have said that he was corrupt. I think that he might have said, because he was very ashamed of being a policeman. So I'm personally, I don't think he was corrupted, but I think he felt that he was doing a job that was not only unpleasant but was unfair. And he talked about the two systems of justice, where a British person on trial in Burma had a much easier time than a local person. It just, there was no comparison. The local people were very unfairly treated, not trusted, subjected to much harsher laws. So he would have said that's corruption. But he had a very high standard. I mean, and the proof of his high standard is he was never interested in money. He never made any money, as I said. And so he was saying, you can't corrupt me. You can't change me. I want to be clear-sighted. I'm going to write what I want to write. You can't tell me what to write. When he wrote 1984, the Book of the Month Club asked him to change. There's a section at the end where he talks about newspeak, and there's an appendix. They said, well, it's a great book. It's going to be Book of the Month Club. We're going to give you a lot of money, but take that out. He said, no, leaving it in. He got them. Well, he got the money. His widow got the money, as I said, but he wouldn't change it. And so I think later he was incorruptible, but it's very interesting because everyone that he was with would have been corrupted to a greater or smaller extent. He might have found going to prostitutes a form of vice, something that you shouldn't do, but the temptation was too great.
So in the past, you've often written a travel book and then followed it with a novel set in that place. Your travels in Burma clearly added a great deal of color to this book.
I was very keen on going to Burma. So my first visit I lived in Singapore. I was a teacher in Singapore for 3 years at the university there. And I had a great ambition to go to Burma, or I want to take the train to Bangkok and then fly to Rangoon and then go up the Irrawaddy and go to Pagan and go to Mamio, Mandalay, see all the places that because I had read Burmese Days then. And I went, so that was 1970. Then I went again, the Great Railway Bazaar trip, I went in 73. Then I went again in 75. So altogether I went 4 times to Burma. And I can tell you just, between me and you, the novel set in Singapore, the main character is called Jack Flowers. Mm-hmm. Jack Flowers, which is a version of John Flory.
Oh, I never picked that up.
Well, there you are. So Jack Flowers. So his name is Fiore. He's Italian. Fiore is flowers in Italian. So it's Jack Flowers. I thought it's a great name, Jack Flowers. But it was because I had read Burmese Days, John Flory. So John Flory is that guy. And the Burma that I found when I went there was unlike anything I'd seen in India or Singapore. It was a completely different place. The food was different. The language was incomprehensible to me. The landscape was utterly different from anything I'd seen. But because they had no investment, there was no change. So all the buildings that existed at the time of Orwell were still there. The old Strand Hotel, mm-hmm. the municipal buildings, the gardens. In Mandalay, the town was unchanged. There were no big hotels. Nothing had changed. Mamio was absolutely the same. There was a building called the Chummery where Orwell had actually stayed. That was the same from Orwell's time. So I found I was actually looking at the background for my book, for Burma Sahib. There it was. I mean, I could fit Orwell to all the places that I had seen in Burma in 1970, which was unchanged from the 1920s. Unchanged, completely unchanged. It was always the poor cousin of the empire. It was a province all by itself. And Orwell said in 1943, Orwell said, Burma is not ready for independence. It's a poor agricultural country that has not developed. It's not ready. In other words, here's a guy, anti-colonial, saying it can't be independent. He said the same thing about India. He said it can't be self-governing. It's not capable of governing itself. He said that in 43. And so it's interesting that the anti-colonial is looking at a colony and saying, I hate colonialism, but it's not ready. So
It was interesting too. I reread those sections of Great Railway Bazaar and Ghost Train to the Eastern Star just the other day, the sections on Burma, and how little had changed between those two trips. How you went back again and found so much similar. Some of the people had changed, obviously, but the same crumbling place.
It's a wonderful experience to go back and find a place hasn't changed. It's an even stranger and wonderful experience to find out that it's transformed. So, I mean, I've had both those experiences. Go back to China, I don't recognize the places that I wrote about writing. I went back to Kunming, completely unrecognizable. Shanghai, completely unrecognizable. Most of the places, unrecognizable. Well, that's exciting. It's something to write about. But Burma was a special case. So I remember I was married. I had children in Singapore, but I went alone because I thought I want to go alone. I want to just improvise this trip and just go. It was a difficult trip. The first trip was in May, very, very hot. And I was staying in very, very bad hotels, and taking the train was horrible.
I remember that train.
Yeah. So, but it was, sometimes you do something early in your life. And so that was 1970. No, here it is. I began the book in 2022. And, all those years later, 50 years later, I'm writing the book, but using the experience from way back. It was very helpful. And I had the advantage that, the biographers of Orwell, I doubt that they had been to Burma when I was there in 70. I was in Singapore in 1968. Singapore in 68 looked like the city that Joseph Conrad would have seen. What wasn't changed at all. There was one Hilton hotel, that was it. But everything else, the cricket pitch, the seaman's house, the library, all the river, the boats, that Conrad would have recognized it. No, he wouldn't recognize it at all. But so the advantage of traveling early and going on living is that you have this experience to draw on, and it was very helpful with Burma Sahib as a novel.
I spent a month in Burma in 2002 as part of a longer journey, and I took that train from Rangoon to Mandalay. It pitched and heaved like a roller coaster, and a rat gave birth under my chair in the middle of the night. We went to Maemyo, the Punalin, and I wasn't staying in Kandacrag. I was on $10 a day, backpacking around, but I went there because you had written about it in Railway Bazaar.
Oh, I inspired you to go. Oh, really? Yeah.
So I wanted to see, what do I think it looks like compared to what you had written? Test my eye in a sense. But I was speaking to the lady there, and she said, I mentioned the book, and she said, "Oh, do you have his number? We'd really love to get back in touch with him." And she was the daughter of the man that you befriended. And then I was very happy to see when the Return Journey came out and that book came out that you had reconnected with those people.
Yeah, the son who remembered his father, and the daughter, and we went and had tea. It was a wonderful experience, actually, and great that they had fixed up. It was the one, I'm sure when you went there, been repainted. It was very It was beautiful. Yeah. It was somewhat decrepit when I saw it, and it was the only place to stay in Maemyo, which is called Pien Luluin now. But yeah, that was wonderful. Going back to meet people. the son saying, I remember when you came in, you were writing and smoking a pipe. And he had a memory of, he was just a little kid at the time. That was great experience to go back and see them. And then I found out more about them and more about their father and how he was an Indian. He'd been in the band. And that was helpful to write about Orwell too, because I realized that the civil service, the police, the army in Burma was mainly Indian, and that Hindi was a very important language for a civil servant to learn, and that the Scots were the backbone of the Raj, but the Indians were the laborers, and the police, the soldiers. The Burmese and Indians were rivals, but the British depended more on Indians than on Burmese. So the Indian strain of life, the Indian aspect of Burma in the 1920s, I actually saw the results of that. So that was also helpful.
And your own formative years in Africa must have been helpful as well. Like you've often said that Africa was the making of you, and you used an epigraph from Burmese days for Burma Sahib. There's a short period in everyone's life where his character is fixed forever. Your fiction in recent years seems to cut much closer to your own life or your past. Like Motherland and Bad Angel Brothers are about large families, and Under the Wave at Waimea is about aging. And Burma Sahib clearly draws on those early years in Africa.
Yes, it definitely does. I was going to say, parenthetically, a former Canadian called Saul Bellow wrote a book called Henderson the Rain King, a book I hate because he wrote it without going to Africa. It's a book about Africa, but he got it out of books. He never went to Africa. Well, I think he went subsequently, but so Saul Bellow's book about Africa is, I find, a dishonest book. I mean, he's just using this local color, which you get out of other books. And I always objected to that as a book used as an example of, oh, I know about Africa, I read Henderson the Rain King. Well, there's something deeply inauthentic to me about it. I'm not saying he shouldn't win the Nobel Prize. He's a great writer. He's a wonderful guy. But that's not a favorite book of mine. I don't know whether my character was fixed in Africa, but certainly I realized I went to Africa with the ambition of becoming a doctor. So I was going to go to medical school. And when I went to Africa, I realized I don't want to be a doctor. I'd like to be a doctor, but I'd like to be a doctor like Chekhov. I would like to be a doctor and write short stories. I'd like to be a doctor like Somerset Maugham was a doctor, and he also wrote novels and so forth. It's possible to be a doctor and a writer, but I realized my vocation to be a writer, to have a subject, to have something to write about, not my hometown, not my family, but something different. What is my place in Africa? So I realized my ambition then. It's why I tell people, you want to become a writer, go somewhere, go find out who you are and what it is you really want. Maybe you'll find out that you're not a writer. But so I could relate to that, and I think that I have someone in the book say that to Orwell. If there's a short period in everyone's life when his character is fixed forever, I think that Burma was the making of Orwell as an ascetic, as an anti-colonial, as someone committed to the political life he said, everything I've written is somehow political, that caring about poverty, oppression, injustice in particular. He was obsessed with the notion of injustice. He gets that from Jack London, but he mainly got it from living in Burma. And so all his ideals were fixed in Burma. And the question you asked me earlier about why wasn't he corrupted is a very, very interesting one, since most people who went there were corrupted in one way or another. And I mean, no one's ever asked me that question, and I don't think anyone has ever really queried that in Orwell's life. Why didn't it corrupt him? But it didn't. It didn't. It changed him, though. It completely changed him. It gave him a direction. And that's why I wrote the book. But I also wrote the book because I could relate to it. I was like Blair and When I was in Africa, he was like Blair in Burma. Suddenly, a brave new world, a new world where there's strange things, different language, different people, and also opportunities, freedom, the freedom that you have living among other people, willing women, power, money. He had a uniform. Suddenly, you're transformed, and you have this different life, and what you do with that life, what you learn from that life. So that's why I wrote the book, and I found it. I mean, the book was. Naipaul once said when he was writing A House for Mr. Biswas, it was my Eden. It was my Eden. When I was writing, I was happy. It was my Eden. And writing Burma Sahib, I felt I was in a completely different mood writing that book from any other book I've written. I wrote it every day for 2 years. Every day. I got up. I've spent a lot of time at the library, of course, and talking to people, but basically that was my Eden. And I've never had that experience, that the intensity of that, of channeling that which is my past and Orwell's past and the Burma that I knew, all of that coalescing in this book, which I'm very happy about the book. The reviews have been among the best, if not the best, I've ever received. Sales, I guess, so this, it will go its own way. That's what happens to books, but it's a very satisfying thing to write. And I have this feeling that when Orwell was writing Burmese Days, it wasn't a satisfying experience. He was trying his hand at a novel, and he thought, well, he was writing about a place that he had been, and he was writing something that was somewhat in opposition to Passage to India, because he had read, and it wasn't completely sold on Forster. And he thought, well, people write about the empire, but I know about the empire. I'm at the sharp end of the empire. I know, the cold, cruel, vicious facts of it, the cruelty of it. Well, people write about the empire as tea parties or parades, music, people playing bagpipes. But he said he knew about hanging, flogging, cruelty, drunkenness. And so he had that. But I think he could have written a better book if he had. And as a matter of fact, at the very end of his life, he started a piece, a novella called A Smoking Room Story, which took place on a ship going or coming home from Burma, A Smoking Room Story. There are only a few lines of it, but when he was in bed dying, he was writing this story about Burma. And so that might have been it. I mean, it's kind of a challenge. Maybe that's an idea. Maybe I should write that, A Smoking Room, the story that Orwell was going to write. Good idea.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so before I let you go, can I ask you two unrelated to Orwell questions? There's two things I've always been curious about. One is about reading. You mentioned your own reading in Figures in a Landscape. You said rather than read a book, I read a writer, or I read a writer, devouring all the novels and stories, and then whatever biography I could find. Now, I did this as well, especially early on. Whenever I found a writer who really floored me, I'd read all the books by this writer, biographies, collected letters, and then finally critical works about them. I did that with Henry Miller, Lawrence Durrell, with your work. Who were the writers that you read in that way, or who were the ones that were most important to your development?
It's a very good question. I'm glad you brought that up because it's an abiding interest of mine. And I once went to a university and they said, we're reading a book, The Mosquito Coast. Can you discuss it? And I said, what other books have you read? This is a seminar at the University of Cincinnati. And they said, well, nothing. I said, apart from Mosquito Coast. They said, that's it. I said, no, you should read some other stuff that I've written. I mean, I was inspired to write the book by taking a trip to Costa Rica and to South America and blah, blah, blah. And I remember the head of the department saying to me, we don't have as much time to read as you civilians. And I thought, you son of a bitch, you ignorant
Jesus.
Son of a bitch. What an insulting thing to say. First, you civilians, he has a job, he has a salary, I don't. The only way to know a book, to know a writer, is to read it all. You read it all, the good books. And do you know something? bad books are more revealing of a writer's character than the good books. That's why Burmese Days is such an interesting book, because it shows a lot about who Blair Orwell was. So you asked a very, very good question, which I can't remember anyone ever asking me this. To answer it, I would say Rebecca West, more recently.
Mm-hmm.
So she wrote one of the great travel books, Black Lamb and Grey Falcon. Mm-hmm. Tremendous essayist called The New Meaning of The Meaning of Treason and The New Meaning of Treason. Her novels, The Birds Fall Down. Then there's a wonderful biography of Rebecca West. Rebecca West was the lover of H.G. Wells. And there's a bit of Orwell connected with Rebecca West, too. So I read everything by Rebecca West. But the other writers, Joseph Conrad, Fitzgerald, Henry Miller did that. Kerouac. More recently, George Simenon. Quite a challenge. He wrote hundreds of novels. I haven't read them all, but I think I've read, and I wrote introductions to a couple of Simenon's novels, one called The Widow. I've read maybe 75 or 80, the very short Simenon novels, Meg Ray and the regular novels. And there are 3 biographies of him. The best one is by a Frenchman called Pierre Assouline. But Patrick Monham's biography is very good. The ones that affected me, so I'm very interested in why did this person write the book? How did he write the book? When he was my age. So when I turned 50, I thought, Orwell once said, at 50, every man has the face he deserves. So I thought, he never made it to 50, by the way. But so Orwell, all the books, all the biographies, the ones that affected me most, it's hard to say, but I would suppose Somerset Maugham. He lived into his 93, I think, when he died. That would affected me a lot. Orwell affected me a lot. Actually, one very good example is V.S. Naipaul. So V.S. Naipaul, I read everything he'd written. I knew him. But I could never have written his biography. The biography by Patrick French is brilliant, and I'm in it. I have a minor part in it, but it's a book that delves very deeply into Naipaul's life. I can't think of one that affected me. I suppose to a certain extent, very surprising since you read Henry Miller. Isn't it interesting that Henry Miller, after Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, where he's seen a kind of rambunctious and, I don't care, I don't give a shit, and I'm drunk and I'm in Paris and he goes in a kind of spiritual journey to Big Sur, where he's writing about Hinduism, Buddhism, the spiritual life, and then reminiscences and so forth. And it has a couple of unhappy marriages, and and women are taking advantage of him. Then he moves to Los Angeles. You think of Henry Miller in a split-level house in Los Angeles playing ping pong, so that's a surprising one as a trajectory of, I don't know how old he was when he died, probably in his mid to late 80s when he died.
Yeah.
But the end of his life, he's in Los Angeles, sunny, salubrious Los Angeles. Henry Miller, the guy from Quiet Days in Clichy and Tropic of Cancer, suddenly transformed. That's amazing. Well, then there's Kerouac. Well, Kerouac, where did he end up? St. Petersburg,
Orlando.
Florida. Yeah, well, Orlando. Florida. Drunk, right wing, and not the same person. He's not on the road, and he's not hitchhiking. It's all a revelation, and so that's a great thing. As far as big influence, I read them all the time. I mean, more recently, I read all the books and the biography of Muriel Spark, who had lived in Africa for a while too. She and has written a little bit about that. Doris Lessing, I read her autobiography, 2-volume of autobiography, which is really great. Walking in the Shade is one. I can't think of the other one. Walking in the Shade, and can't think of the other one. Very good autobiography. Numerous books, including science fiction. There's a biography of her by Patrick French coming out next year.
Hmm.
And I knew Patrick French, and I put Patrick French in touch with the lover of the Golden Notebook, a wonderful guy called Clancy Siegel. Clancy Siegel I knew in London, then he moved to Los Angeles, but he was Doris's lover. And so Patrick talked to him in LA, and then Clancy died. So it was great. Unfortunately, Patrick also died, but I think the book is done. So anyway, as a project, because I didn't go to graduate school, I've never done postgraduate work. The way to know a book or a writer, read all the books, if they're good books, even if they're bad, they might be mixed in, like Faulkner's, or Fitzgerald's for that matter, and then read the biography, and then you know the person. And if you want to be a writer, that's the way to read. You don't read one book. You don't read As I Lay Dying and then say, I want to write. You read everything, and you realize that a writer often writes bad books. He writes boring books. He writes books that maybe he shouldn't have written, but that's the way to another book. And that's the writing life, which is the opus of it. Flaubert is a good example of that. I mean, Madame Bovary is brilliant. Bouvard and Pécuchet is not a great book. I mean, it's a weird book. Salammbô, great book. So you could say, I don't like to be quoted saying Flaubert is uneven, but Flaubert is uneven, And the biography is wonderful. He died in his 50s, but brilliant, wonderful. So anyone listening to this, you want to become a writer, you want to be a real reader, do that. Read all the books, all the poems, all the books, then read the autobiography, and then read the biography. And then you could say, I know that writer. And that becomes a period in your life too, when you're reading, when you're completely immersed in that writer. Wonderful experience, actually.
The other question I had was about your fiction. One of the things I liked about your early novels is how you tried your hand at different genres. From the literary to, like, The Black House was kind of a gothic novel. The Family Arsenal you could see as a thriller. Ozone was science fiction. Fictional autobiography we've mentioned, My Other Life and My Secret History. They were all tied together with the sort of, compelling detail or bit of revealing dialogue that I associate with your writing. But was this a conscious decision to experiment with form at that time, or did it just sort of happen that way?
I think both. I think partly being inspired by circumstances and thinking, I have this idea, but what is the best form for this idea? And what's the best way of telling this story? What's the best form? And so I didn't have a style. I wasn't affecting a style, but I thought, I've got an idea, and expressing that idea. I'm not the only person who's done it. I mean, other people have done it. Simenon's done it, and other writers have written in different forms. And so it was conscious to the extent of saying, what is the best way of doing it? Like short story. I mean, some short stories are like ventriloquism, others are like confessions, others are like a thriller, and or a mystery story, whatever it is. That's in microcosm. And I think I've written different forms of shorts. Short story can be a letter, it could be just a letter, which is a story, or it could be just dialogue, which I've done. So it's also stimulating to do it, to try something new, like Ozone set in the future, or The Black House as a dark story about the West Country of England. And I think that my travel books have also been different. The Great Railway Bazaar was praised. I've looked at it, there's a lot wrong with it. I mean, it was written by a guy, not the man I am now, but someone who took a trip, didn't know what he was doing, came home to an unhappy marriage, and needed to write a book, and was trying to put the best face on the book. So that's The Great Railway Bazaar. It's not the book that I wrote later, and it's not the book that I would write now. If you compare that with my Mexico book, On the Plain of Snake, totally different book. totally different. Or the Deep South book, totally different. And so they're all travel books, you could say, but they're different travel books. And so I've learned a lot. I think I'm less flippant. I care more about what I'm doing. I'm trying harder to represent a place, but I'm an old guy now. I mean, that's where I've arrived. And so that was my journey, to use the words that kids use these days. That was my journey. And I've learned a lot. And that's what happens. So it would have been very interesting to know, what would Orwell have done had he lived longer? So he did the same thing. His early books are H.G. Wells. Then he's writing a Jack London book. Then he's writing an animal fable. Then he's writing a book about the future. So other people do it. I mean, and he was writing a book about Burma in the months that he died. I must look at that. There's a reference to it, a smoking room story, but he tried. So that's what I've done. Because I've spent a lot of time alone at my desk, and to stay interested in what you're doing, to stay fascinated by what you're doing, you have to care about what you write. And I'm not just making up stories. I need seriously to care about what I'm doing. An early question that Naipaul asked was, why are you writing this book? Ask yourself why you're writing this book. And if you can't answer that question, you shouldn't be writing it. Don't play with art, was one of his lines. I learned a lot from him. He was a very imperfect person, but I learned a lot. And so the different forms that I've used probably reflect my reading. I read thrillers, I read detective stories, I read books about the future, I read autobiographical fiction. So there you are. It reflects my life and it reflects my reading, which is I want any reasonable, sensible, truthful writer would say, I think.
It's interesting that you reached this point where you're just talking about your travel books. I want to close with something Jonathan Rabin said about you in an interview. He said, compared to the tone of the earlier work, its sarcasm, its sharp observation, and always being from the point of view of an absolute outsider, Paul has developed a kind of humanity in the recent books that I hadn't seen before. I think we see this in Burma Sahib. I mean, would you agree with Rabin's observation?
Yeah, I think it's true. He was a very good friend of mine. He knew my work very well, and I knew his work well. And so even when he was dying, I mean, he was on his last leg. He had a leg amputated, his last leg, working on his book, Father and Son. We corresponded over the years, talked on the phone early. I knew him in London. I knew him first, began writing to him, and we became friends in 1969 when I was in Singapore, and I knew him in London. So that sense of humor, you can't go on writing just spinning your wheels. You need to care. You need to know why you're writing. And I suppose, I don't know, he used the word humanity. I'd like to think that's true, but caring more. I care much more about people and travel than landscapes. I care much more about other people's stories. I think that's the human architecture of travel. I think that's what I really care about, rather than the adventure or the bravado or the sarcasm or the cheap shot. I mean, I think other people are much more interesting than I am. They've lived in much greater danger, in much greater poverty, and with much greater risks. Those are the people I want to listen to. Those are the people you learn from. And they're real people. So I've become more of a listener, I suppose. I think that's something that Jonathan was probably saying. It's a nice thing to say, though. And he was a very perceptive person, and you can see from his essays, he's a great essayist and a good traveler. He didn't travel widely, but he traveled well. So, that's a nice quote. I think I've read it. I don't know where he said it, but I read it. Was it in an interview?
Yeah, interview, yeah.
Well, also, he knew my work over the years, so he knew it from earliest times. So that's the other thing, that's the trajectory. It's why I'm saying to people, if you're a real reader, you'll want to read from the early books and the later books and just see where this writer is trending. Where is he going? Where is she going? what has this writer learned? How have they changed? And that fascinates me. And it also is a way of examining my own life. Where am I going? What's happening? What next? So, yeah. But I've always felt, after I've finished a novel, after I've sat at a desk for 2 years writing a book, I have a strong urge to up stakes and I just want to go some. My wife recognizes this. I said the other day, I said, I really want to go somewhere. She said, go, follow your bliss, do it. Because I hate sitting at a desk. And to me, taking a trip, writing a travel book is a cure for that. You need to be cured of staying at home and being, immobilized at your desk. May I say, Ryan, that I'm really pleased that you've read so much of my work, that you're so familiar with it. Not many people are that I talk to. So it's a pleasure that you can refer to these books that I haven't reread, I've even somewhat forgotten, and you quote things, and it's a great compliment, and it's a pleasure, and it's a rare thing too. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. I've read all of your books, as you know, and they're a huge influence on me as a young traveler and as a young writer. And I've gotten an enormous enjoyment from them as a reader. And I think you've done it again with Burma Sahib.
Well, thanks very much, and it's great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.